In the 20th century, when hippie culture was popular in Europe and the United States, there was a travel line called the Hippie Trail. In those days, drawn to the religions and philosophies of the East, hippies followed this line across the Eurasian continent, starting from Western Europe, passing through Istanbul, crossing the Middle East, and finally arriving in, India and Nepal. However, the hippie trail also caught the attention of a serial killer, Charles Sobhraj, known as the Serpent. He and his criminal accomplices used hitchhiking, drugs, and lies as bait to commit a series of brutal and heinous robbery and murder cases there. April 6, 1944, Charles was born in Saigon, Indochina Union, which was renamed Ho Chi Minh City in 1976 and is located in Vietnam. His father was a Sindhi from India, and his mother was a Vietnamese woman with French citizenship. Charles' childhood was full of ups and downs. His parents were never married, and his father ruthlessly denied any paternal relationship with him. But fate did not completely abandon Charles. Later, Charles' mother married a Frenchman, a French army lieutenant stationed in the Indian colony. Initially, both his mother and stepfather were extremely caring towards him, taking him along whether they were in Southeast Asia or back in France. It was during these years that Charles grew up in a stable environment. In 1959, when he was 15 years old, with the help of his stepfather, his name was officially changed to Charles. But it's common knowledge that stepchildren can have a big impact on the birth of new life within a family. Charles was clearly the surplus one, and his emotional needs gradually began to be ignored by his mother and stepfather. During this time, he got into some small-time trouble. In 1963, he was first sent to prison for burglary and served his time in the Poissy prison near Paris. In those dark days, Charles received special favors from the prison officials who allowed him to read books in his cell. It was also during this time that Charles met Felix, a young man from a wealthy family. Felix was one of the prison volunteers at the time. Every week, he would come to the prison to help the inmates write letters, resolve simple legal issues, and provide companionship. Charles, with his charm and lies, quickly became good friends with Felix, who even wanted to help him reconcile with his parents, though with limited success. After being paroled, Charles moved in with Felix. There, Charles began to navigate between the high society and the underworld of Paris, amassing his wealth through a series of burglaries and frauds. Meanwhile, he met Chantal, a young Parisian girl from a conservative family. Shortly after they met, they confirmed their romantic relationship. However, on the very day Charles proposed to Chantal, he was arrested while trying to evade the police while driving a stolen vehicle and was sentenced to 8 months in prison. Although Charles' imprisonment, Chantal never left him. She waited for him while he was serving his sentence. Therefore, as soon as Charles was released, he immediately married Chantal. In 1970, with Felix's help and due to his birth in a French colony, Charles obtained French citizenship. That same year, he left France quietly with Chantal, who was pregnant, heading to India because the French police were investigating his crimes. At that time, they traveled through Eastern Europe with fake documents and even robbed tourists they met along the way. After arriving in Mumbai, India, Charles, in order to satisfy his increasingly severe gambling addiction, continued his criminal career, engaging in car theft, smuggling, and robbery. It was during this time that he met Marie, a young backpacker from Canada. Influenced by Charles' sweet talk and carefully crafted facade, she became his most loyal follower. Meanwhile, Ajay, a young Indian man and a criminal, also became his accomplice. Notably, both Marie and Ajay would later become Charles' accomplices in murders. In 1971, Charles carried out a jewelry robbery at the Ashok Hotel in Delhi, India, which also attracted the attention of the police. Coincidentally, a criminal who had received help from the police joined Charles' criminal gang. Having seen that Charles and his associates were carrying firearms, he fearfully approached the police officer who had helped him, named Zende, and revealed Charles' plan to carry out a robbery near the Taj Hotel in Mumbai. Based on the information provided by this criminal, Zende set up a stackout near the Taj Hotel in Mumbai. Ultimately, Zende and his team successfully arrested Charles and his 5 criminal accomplices, confiscating the rifle and revolver used for the robbery. Charles was an extremely cunning individual. During his imprisonment, he feigned appendicitis and was admitted to the hospital. Later, he took advantage of the power outages caused by the India-Pakistan War to stealthily escape from the hospital's drainpipe, right under the noses of the guards. He was soon recaptured by the police. With no other choice, Charles borrowed money from his stepfather to pay the bail. Several days later, he fled to Kabul, Afghanistan with Chantal. In there, Charles and Chantal robbed Western tourists along the hippie trail. Not long after, he was arrested by the Afghan police for offenses such as car theft, illegal border crossing, and refusal to pay hotel bills. Once again, he resorted to his old tricks, faking illness and drugging the guards at the hospital to successfully escape from prison. However, this time, seeing her husband's actions, although Chantal still loved him, she had grown tired of the life of constant criminality and flight, so she took their daughter back to France and said never to see Charles again. Over the next 2 years, Charles was constantly on the run from the police. Knowing the weaknesses of human nature, sometimes he would disguise himself as a gemstone salesman, and at other times he would pose as a drug dealer, using carefully woven lies to deceive Western tourists, befriend them, and extract money from them as well as steal their passports. After arriving in Istanbul, Charles met his half-brother, Andrei. Soon they became criminal accomplices and committed a series of crimes in Turkey and Greece. Eventually they were arrested in Athens, Greece. Charles managed to escape, but Andrei was handed over to the Turkish police and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. In 1975, Charles fled to Thailand. It was here that he and Ajay committed their first known murder. Later on, the police said that most of the people killed by Charles were actually part of his gang and had committed crimes. Charles said that most of his murders were accidental, due to overdoses of temazepam and heroin. To counter Charles' argument, the police insisted that the real reason for the murders was that the victims had threatened to expose Charles' criminal activities. Those days were the heyday of the hippie trail. A large number of backpackers and hippies traveled along the hippie trail to India, Nepal, and Thailand. It is well known the cultures and languages of Europe and Asia are completely different. For Western backpackers and hippies, arriving in Asia was like entering a completely different world, where tension and anxiety were extremely common. Charles took advantage of this. Speaking the same language, he fabricated false names and identities for himself, offering these tourists language assistance and places to stay, thereby gaining their trust. Charles' first victim was a young woman named Teresa Knowlton. She was from Seattle, United States. When her body was found, she was lying in a pool on the Gulf of Thailand, wearing a floral bikini. Initially, it was thought to be a swimming accident. However, an autopsy and forensic evidence several months later proved that her drowning was actually a murder. Next, a young Sephardic Jew named Vitaly Hakim became Charles' next victim. His body was found on the way to the resort in Pattaya, which was where Charles and his criminal gang were hiding. Later, a 29-year-old Dutch student, Henk Bintanja, and his 25-year-old fiancée, Cornelia Hemker, met Charles in Hong Kong and were invited by him to Thailand. Like the other victims, they were poisoned by Charles, affecting their health. Naturally, Charles used the excuse of taking care of their recovery to keep them in Thailand. As Henk and Cornelia gradually recovered, Vitaly's French girlfriend, Charmaine Carew, came to visit Charles, intending to find the missing Vitaly. Charles knew that if she discovered the truth, his crimes would be exposed. So he and Ajay quickly drove Henk and Cornelia out. Shortly after they were found, they had been strangled and burned. Charmaine was also found drowned, wearing a swimsuit style identical to Teresa's. At that time, investigators did not connect Teresa's and Charmaine's deaths. Later, when these cases were linked to Charles, he earned the nickname Bikini Killer. December 18, 1975, the very day that Henk and Cornelia were found, Charles and Marie brazenly used the couple's passports to enter Nepal. A few days later, on December 21st to 22nd, in Nepal, Charles brutally murdered 26-year-old Canadian Laurent and 29-year-old American Connie. Later, Charles and Marie used Laurent and Connie's passports to return to Thailand. However, upon returning to Thailand, Charles unexpectedly learned that 3 French tourists he had deceived had discovered the victim's identity documents and suspected him of multiple murders, reporting the case to the police and fleeing back to Paris. Charles' next destination was reportedly Varanasi or Kolkata. There, he committed another murder in order to obtain the passport of Israeli scholar Avoni Jacob, and then, with Marie and Ajay, he traveled using the victims' passports, first to Singapore and back to India. In March 1976, despite knowing that the Thai police were investigating him, Charles returned to Bangkok once again. This time, he and Marie, along with Ajay, were interrogated by the police in connection with the murders but were released. Meanwhile, Dutch diplomat Herman Nippenberg and his wife Angela Kane were working hard to investigate the murders of Henk and Cornelia. Herman had some knowledge of Charles and may have even seen him, though he was unaware of Charles' true identity. Later, with the help of Charles' neighbors Nadine and Remy Girard, he filed a lawsuit against Charles. However, it was only a month after Charles had left Thailand that Herman obtained police permission to search Charles' apartment, where he found concrete evidence of Charles' crimes, including the victims' documents and passports, as well as poison and syringes. Charles and Marie, along with Ajay, next headed to Malaysia. There, Ajay was seen handing over gems to Charles, which was the last time he was spotted. It is said that before Charles left Malaysia, he killed Ajay to eliminate any potential threats and continued to pose as a gem dealer with Marie. Later, there were claims that Ajay was seen in West Germany, but this assertion was never verified. In May 1976, Interpol issued an international arrest warrant for Charles, charging him with 4 murders in Thailand. However, Charles did not halt his activities. Instead, he formed a new criminal gang. The new members were 2 Western women living in Mumbai, Barbara Smith and Mary Either. His next victim was a Frenchman named Solomon, who was poisoned by Charles during a robbery. Charles had initially intended only to incapacitate Solomon and take his passport, but he accidentally killed him. In July 1976, in New Delhi, he and his 3 female accomplices deceived a group of French graduate students, convincing them to accept them as guides. During this time, Charles drugged the students, claiming the substances were anti-dysentery medication. However, the drugs took effect faster than Charles had anticipated. Before reaching their destination, some of the students began to lose consciousness. 3 of the students realized what Charles had done, quickly subdued him, and contacted the police. Later, Charles' accomplices Barbara and Either confessed during the interrogation. Charles was charged with the murder of Solomon, and all 4 were sent to Tihar Jail in New Delhi. While in Tihar Jail in New Delhi, Barbara and Either experienced extreme despair in the 2 years leading up to their trial, both attempting to end their lives in prison. However, Charles seemed to be in a completely different world. He entered the prison with valuable gems and used his extensive experience in bribery and kidnapping. He lived an extremely comfortable life in prison, with access to a television and gourmet food, and befriended both the guards and other inmates. Additionally, he turned the trial into a spectacle, casually hiring and firing lawyers, and even enlisted the help of his paroled brother André. Ultimately, Charles was sentenced to only 12 years in prison after staging a hunger strike. Meanwhile, Marie was convicted of drugging the French students. Later, due to her ovarian cancer, she was deported back to Canada. According to reports, even before her death, Marie still tried to defend Charles. In his imprisonment, Charles also gave interviews to Western writers and journalists, freely discussing his murders with them. However, later on, he denied his previous statements, pretending that his actions were a form of revenge against Western imperialism in Asia. In March 1986, during the 10th year of his imprisonment and just before his sentence was about to end, Charles realized that he was about to be extradited to Thailand for trial and would likely face the death penalty. So, he threw a grand party for his guards and fellow inmates, drugged them with sleeping pills during the event, and took the opportunity to walk out of the prison. In order to capture Charles, the Indian police turned to Zende, who had arrested him over a decade earlier. Receiving the order, Zende assembled a team and began tracking Charles' whereabouts. Their investigation went extremely smoothly, quickly yielding 2 key leads. The first was from a hotel owner in Mumbai who noticed that a man's license plate did not match the official records. The second was from a telephone exchange in Goa, which showed that a man frequently visited a restaurant and made international calls. Zende, posing as a tourist, spent several days observing the restaurant. On the evening of April 6, 1986, Zende saw Charles, wearing a hat, enter the restaurant gracefully. And then, he and his team approached Charles and said, "Hello, Charles. How are you?" Hearing this, Charles attempted to draw his weapon but was swiftly arrested by Zende's team. Later, due to his prison escape, Charles was sentenced to an additional 10 years in prison. However, this was precisely what Charles had anticipated. On February 17, 1997, at the age of 52, Charles walked out of prison. By this time, most of his arrest warrants and evidence had become invalid, and even the witnesses had long since disappeared. Since no country could extradite Charles, the Indian police could only watch as he returned to France. Living in the suburbs of Paris, Charles led an extremely comfortable life. He earned substantial fees from interviews and photo shoots, and even the rights to a movie based on his life were sold for over $15 million. However, Charles seemed to have been intoxicated by the attention he received. In 2003, he made an inexplicable decision to return to Nepal, one of the few countries where he could be arrested. On September 1, 2003, a reporter from the Himalayan Times chanced upon Charles in a casino in Kathmandu. In order to gain attention, the reporter followed Charles for 2 weeks and wrote a news article with photographs. After seeing the report, the Nepalese police quickly took action, raided the casino, and arrested Charles while he was gambling. In 2004, Charles was sentenced to life imprisonment for the 1975 murder of Connie. On September 18, 2014, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the 1975 murder of Laurent. On December 23, 2022, the Supreme Court of Nepal ordered Charles' release from prison on humanitarian grounds due to his advanced age and deteriorating health. This day, at the age of 81, Charles still lives in France, though his condition is frail. No one knows exactly how many people Charles killed. He has made various confessions and admitted to 12 murders. However, given his frequent lies and tendency to retract his statements, it is clear that 12 is likely not the true number. Although the exact number of his victims and his motives for killing remain uncertain, one thing is certain: Charles shows no remorse for his crimes.